So to Reverend Andrews and Dr. Desiree, I also want to just thank you because I've been reading and listening and hearing about your leadership for so long. And I was so honored when you asked me to come and join for the 150th anniversary. So thank you, thank you, thank you. So there's so much to talk about, but I'll start with this. I think we all know this is really a historic moment in the history of our country. We're at a pivotal moment. Stevie Wonder last weekend, I don't know if anybody heard, he said, "I'm taking a knee for America." But then, because we love Stevie went on to say, "But not just one knee, I'm taking both knees. Both knees in prayer for our planet, our future, and the leaders of our world." So as we pray for our future with Stevie and each other, I've been thinking a lot about this concept of justice. All the great prophets spoke about justice. And they spoke about justice in a particular way. They spoke about it with special attention to the oppressed, the weary, and the weak. And so I want to take as my text today, Proverbs 31:9, which says, speak up for the poor and the helpless. See that they get justice. And First Church understands this point more than most. Justice is one of the main bricks upon which this church was built. You've hosted the voices of Booker T. Washington to Vernon Jordan, from Calvin Butts to Bernice King. And the theme of this 150th anniversary, building on purpose, speaks to the very purpose of this church, the purpose of justice. First Church spoke up only a few years after the Civil War when former slaves founded a little chapel on Houston Street to teach and minister to free men and women. First Church spoke up a few generations after the abolition of slavery and established prison ministries, a library, and a kindergarten to lift up the community. This congregation spoke up 60 years ago and joined a young preacher down the road, drafting the blueprint for what would become the civil rights movement. And indeed today, First Church is speaking up, tending to those with HIV and feeding the hungry. Now, my background is that I was born in Oakland, California, among and in a place where people also spoke up in their fight for justice. My parents met when they were graduate students at the University of California, Berkeley, and they were active in the civil rights movement. So my sister and I joke we grew up surrounded by a bunch of adults who spent full time marching and shouting. And I grew up in Oakland, then attending the 23rd Avenue Church of God, where we learn about caring for the least of these. And I sang in the choir about how faith, combined with the determination, will always see us through difficult times. My mother was from India, and so in addition, she would take us to a Hindu temple to see that all faiths teach us to pursue justice. And growing up, the heroes of my youth were the leaders of the civil rights movement. Leaders like Ambassador Young, lawyers like Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston and Constance Baker Motley. And inspired because of their fight for justice, I attended Howard University and then law school in California. And when I finished law school, it came time for me to decide what I would do, and my family gathered around. They said, "Okay, Kamala, what are you going to do in your fight for justice?" And I said, "Well, I've decided to become a prosecutor." Now, you can imagine, there were some in my family who thought it a curious decision because, of course, they thought, you should go and be defending folks instead of prosecuting. And some of them put me on trial in a way that I had to actually defend myself with that decision. But what I said then and what I believed then, I believe today. Law enforcement has such a profound and direct impact on the most vulnerable and voiceless among us. And there is a duty then to give voice to the vulnerable, give voice to the voiceless, and give dignity in the process. So I went on that path. I was elected District Attorney of San Francisco and later Attorney General of California. In both positions, I was the first woman and the first woman of color. And in doing that work, part of the purpose of doing that work was to create what ended up being national models around what we should do around recidivism and reentry for former offenders. And a lot of that work was motivated not only because of what I believe we need to do to be smart on crime, which is to understand prevention as one of the best and most effective ways to reduce crime, but underlining it also was the age-old concept that the Bible teaches us, the concept of redemption. Understanding we will all make a mistake. And for some, that mistake may rise to the level of being a crime. But is it not the sign of a just society that we allow folks a way to earn their way back? That is the concept of redemption. And so it is through all of these life experiences that I'm honored to be with you today as a member of the United States Senate. And I'd like to talk a bit then about not only what we must do in terms of being strong of faith, but what we must do to confront the challenges that are right in front of us. So the book of Luke reads, "Shine a light on those living in darkness, to guide our feet into the path of peace." Shine a light on those living in darkness, to guide our feet into the path of peace. Now, I believe shine a light means we must speak truth, even when we know speaking truth will often make people quite uncomfortable. And to be sure, the book of Luke does not say that the path toward peace will be soft or easy or well paved. Instead, as we all know, it is likely, most often, to be rocky and probably up a steep hill, like that hill we heard about earlier this morning. But there's no question it is a journey we must take. So let's shine a light then, and let's speak truth to allow us to be on a path toward peace. So as we all know, we are at then this inflection moment in the history of our country, like that moment when my parents first met. And this is a moment then that we know where our country is witnessing an assault on our deepest values, an assault on our commitment to equality, to fairness, and to justice. So let's speak truth. Let's speak truth that we have been reminded of too often over these past few months. Racism is real in this country. Sexism is real in this country. Homophobia is real in this country. Anti-Semitism is real in this country. Because unless we speak that truth, we will not confront it honestly. Let's speak the truth that there is a systematic attempt to suppress the right to vote in America. And as you remember, in 2013, the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. And since then, church, there have been 10 federal court decisions that have found intentional discrimination against voters of color. One court even said they, quote, target African Americans with almost surgical precision. And when John Lewis said, this is a poll tax by another name, I could not agree with him more. Let's speak the truth. Let's speak the truth that right now in our country, immigrants are being vilified and scapegoated and are living in fear that a midnight knock on a door will separate them from their families. Let's speak the truth. Let's speak the truth that while we sit here, fellow Americans in Puerto Rico are suffering without electricity and with hardly any access to food or water. Let's speak the truth that just like our friends and relatives in Texas and Florida, Puerto Rico deserves to be a priority. Let's speak the truth that the Attorney General of the United States has re-escalated the failed war on drugs while de-escalating smart police reform and criminal justice reform. Let's speak the truth. Let's speak the truth. That when Americans demand recognition that their lives matter, or kneel to call attention to justice, that is an expression of free speech protected by our Constitution and should not be threatened or bullied. And finally, let's speak the truth, another truth. Although in our country today, there are forces of hate and division trying to tear us apart, Americans have so much more in common than what separates us. And that is the truth. In fact, earlier this year, I had a conversation with a group of 17 and 18-year-old students when our daughter, Ella, asked me to speak at her high school. And one student asked this question that broke my heart. It was one of the first questions. She raised her hand and she asked me, what are we going to do about a divided America? And it broke my heart. And I looked at her, I paused for a moment, and then I said, you know what? I challenge the premise. I don't believe we are divided. I believe the vast majority of us have so much more in common than what separates us. And here's how I think about that. I think about it through the lens of that 3 o'clock in the morning thought. Now, most of us have had it. You know, they call it the bewitching hour, Reverend, right? 3 o'clock in the morning when we wake up in a cold sweat with that thing that's been weighing on us, and we wake up thinking that thought. We never wake up thinking that thought through the political party we're registered to vote with. We never wake up thinking that thought through the demographic that some pollster put us in. And when we wake up thinking that thought, for the vast majority of Americans, it has to do with just one of a very few things: our personal health, the health of our children or our parents. Can I get a job? Can I keep a job? Can I pay the bills by the end of the month? Can I pay off those student loans? Can I retire with dignity? The vast majority of us have so much more in common than what separates us. And I'll give you another specific example of this point. I've been working on a bill to reform the money bail system in our country. And for those of you, unlike Josie Duffy, who may not know how it works, it is a system that basically, I'll give you an example. Let's say a woman goes into a department store and steals something of great value. So it's considered grand theft, not petty theft. She gets arrested because it's a crime. She gets charged because it's a crime. She goes to jail, and then she shows up for her first court appearance. The judge looks at her and says, okay, well, for this crime, the bail will be $20,000, which is the average bail in America. Well, the average American does not have $20,000 sitting around. So her family may be in the courtroom, and they'll say, well, we got to get Auntie out. Let's go across the street to what's across the street from every courthouse in America, the bail bondsman. The bail bondsman says, I'll give you the $20,000, but you have to give me 10%, and you will not get that back. The average American family does not have $2,000 sitting around. So what ends up happening? They either beg, borrow, and steal to get that money, or she sits in jail for what could be weeks, months, even years waiting trial. God forbid she has young children at home by themselves. They'll at the very least be not taken care of, or equally likely Child Protective Services might take those children. Or it is also possible her lawyer may say, well, if you plead guilty, you'll get credit for time served and you can get out. Even if she has a defensible case, looking at those options, what do you think she's going to do? So this bill that we're working on decided that what we're going to do is we want to replace the money bail system with a risk assessment system, where the judge instead would make a decision about whether this person poses a risk to society. So being in Washington, D.C., and everything is so partisan, I thought, this is an issue that we shouldn't be thinking about this way. So I'm going to walk down the hall and knock on the door of somebody who might be willing to work on it with me. And I knocked on the door of a United States Senator from Kentucky. His name is Rand Paul. And I said, I'm working on this bill. Would you be interested? And he said, yeah, I think I would. So we wrote an op-ed. We wrote an opinion piece in the New York Times, which then got published. And days later, Reverend, I just wanted to make sure he was still okay now that his folks learned that he was working with me. And I said, how are you doing? How's everybody responding? And he said, Kamala, Appalachia loves this because we have so much more in common than what separates us. So I believe it is time that we replace the divide and conquer and that kind of approach with a new way of thinking. I've come up with an equation, which is this: diversity, because we are a diverse country. Diversity plus commonality equals unity. Right? Diversity plus commonality, seeing what we all have in common, will be the path toward our unity, which brings us peace. And so let's think about it in that way. Let's think about it in understanding that our fight for justice is something that will be and always has been empowered by our commonality. Let's agree that our diversity is our strength and our strength is our unity. Let's agree that in these moments when others are trying to convince us we have nothing in common, that these are the exact moments when we must embrace our commonality the most. And let's agree that history has taught us that the embrace of our commonality builds coalitions across issues, across groups, across religions, across races, across regions. It is the muscle that powers our movement. And it's easy to feel overwhelmed by the challenges we face, and in particular as a Black community. The legacy of the oppressed and oppression has been felt since we arrived in chains. But we are leaders, and I know we will embrace the role we've always played in building coalitions with people knowing we have common goals. Because first, it is the Christian thing to do, no matter how little we have in common with our fellow travelers. And second, it is the smart thing to do. When we move forward as a community, when we advance as a family, we become an overwhelming force. And third, it is the patriotic thing to do. Building coalitions to wage this fight for justice is about love of country. It's about patriotism. And I think there are two definitions of what it means to be a patriot. One describes those who condone the conduct of their country, whatever it does. The other is the kind of patriot I believe us all to be. The kind who believe in the ideals of our country and will fight for those ideals. And so when we fight for the ideals behind the Constitution of the United States and the Bill of Rights, that is the very definition of being a patriot. When we fight for our right to speak out, freely assemble, and peacefully demonstrate, when we fight for a free press that holds the powerful accountable, that is a fight for the rights guaranteed by the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, and that is patriotic. When we fight for the right to vote, guaranteed to every citizen under the 15th and 19th Amendments, we are patriots. And when we fight for the equality of each and every one of us, an ideal that Americans fought and died for, that is a fight for the 14th Amendment, and that is patriotic. And my final point is this. When we sing the Star-Spangled Banner, we rightly about brave men and women from all backgrounds who proudly defend the freedom of those they may never meet and people who will never know their names. When we sing the Star-Spangled Banner, we also think about those marching in the streets who demand that the ideals of that flag represent them too. We think, when we sing that song, about the young immigrant who puts her hand over her heart and pledges allegiance to the only country she's ever called home. And we think about women like the women I recently visited at a California state prison. They were making American flags, the kind you see waving over the United States Capitol and down the street at the Georgia State Capitol. And that day when I was looking at those women and talking with them, they were doing everything, by the way, from cutting the fabric to silk screening and pushing the paint through the stars and stripes. And I thought, yes, certainly they have made mistakes, but that is their flag too. So let us be clear that when we talk about our patriotism and love of country, it is about understanding our commonality. It is about fighting for who we are. And most important, it is about fighting for who we can be. Fighting for who we can be. So, First Church, at this pivotal moment, I say we cannot throw up our hands. Instead, this is a moment in time to roll up our sleeves. And as the Reverend and I were talking earlier, I'll say, I'm a realist. I am also an optimist. And as we read in Scripture earlier, those who sow with tears will reap with songs of joy. So as we shine a light on the path toward peace, let us do so as proud patriots. Let us have the courage to speak truth. And together, armed with our commonality and armed with our faith, let us be strong in our fight for justice. Thank you. And God bless.